Well, welcome back. It's great to be here with you again. Now, we have not a hero today, we have a heroine. That's a lady that's a hero. It's a heroine. Now, her name was Esther. She lived around 500 BC. As a young girl or young woman, she left the homeland of Judah and traveled to the town of Susa in Babylonia. And there, we don't know if her parents died, if they didn't come with her. We're not quite sure. But we know that Esther, her name was also Hadassah. She lived with a relative, Mordecai. And sometimes Mordecai is called an uncle, and sometimes he's called a cousin. But he was a distant relative, and Esther lived with him, was under his care. Now, Mordecai was one of the men who sat at the king's gate. He was a scribe. And when activities went on that needed to be written down, he would write them down. The king threw a huge party. His name was Xerxes. And he was looking around and saw all of the wealth he had and all the country that was his. And he decided to have a huge party and invite all the top men from the provinces to come to the party. The party lasted for half a year. That's a big party, isn't it? That's just not one day, half a year. And then he decided to have one more party, another week, and invite everybody from Susa to come to the second party. And there was lots of food and drink and activity. But the king, he drank too much and he got drunk. And one of the things that happened during that week was that he commanded his queen, her name was Vashti. That's kind of an odd name, isn't it? Vashti. But she was known for her beauty. But she was having a special party with the women in a different part of the palace. And the king commanded that Vashti come in all of her royal, that means her crown and her fancy clothes, all of her royal beauty, to come to the king's party because he wanted to show her off. And Queen Vashti said, no. She said no to the king. And when the king heard this, he was upset. And he asked a couple of his special advisors, what should I do? The queen said no. And the special advisors advised the king that then the queen should lose her position. There should be no more queen. And that's what the king did. He announced in front of all of his governors and princes, the land has no more queen. Well, after a while, his servants thought, this isn't right. The country should have a queen. And they went to the king and said, King, we need to have a new queen. Send a law throughout the land that all the young ladies should be brought in and that they will go through beauty treatments, a year's worth of beauty treatments, and brought to the king, and he will pick a new queen from among them. The king thought that sounds like a pretty good idea, so they sent the law out that young ladies were brought to the king, and they went through a year of beauty treatments. It would be special food, special ointments rubbed on them. And one of the girls that was brought was Esther. She left Mordecai behind, and she was taken to the palace and put in the charge of a eunuch by the name of Haggai. Now, he saw something different in Esther, different than in the other young ladies. But first I should tell you that Esther and Mordecai had talked. And Mordecai said, Esther, if you go to the palace, you should not tell anyone that you're a Jew from the land of Judah. Esther didn't seem to think this was right, but she agreed, okay. So when Haggai saw Esther, and he wanted to bring her the best food and gave her a great place to stay, Esther didn't want to eat the food that was offered, the stuff that she would consider was unclean. But after a year, it was Esther's turn to go and see the king. And she asked Haggai, how should I dress? What should I take with me? And she listened to him because he wanted her to do good. And Esther went to the king. And when the king saw her, he proclaimed her as the new queen. Now, isn't that a great story? But it doesn't stop there, because now Esther is queen, and her uncle, Mordecai, still sits outside at the gate. And every day, coming into the palace, was a man by the name of Haman. Now, Haman hated the Jews. And what was Esther and what was Mordecai? They were both Jews. And Haman went to the king without realizing that Esther was a Jew and said to the king, King, there's a group of people in your country that are very bad, and we need to destroy them all. And the king said, okay, that sounds like good advice. He didn't look into it, but he took Haman's word for it. And they wrote a law that on a certain day in a certain month, all the Jews would be destroyed. And their property would all be given to the people who killed them. Well, when the law was written and Mordecai heard about it, he sent a special private message to Esther and said, Esther, you have to do something. You have to help our people. And Esther said, but what can I do? I can't do anything. I can't go to the king. If I go to the king when he has not asked me to come, I could be killed, unless the king reaches out with his golden scepter. If he does, then he pardons me and I can approach him. Well, when Mordecai heard what Esther said, he was sad. He sent back a message. Esther, do you think just because you live in the palace, just because you're queen, that you won't be killed? Somebody will know that you're a Jew. You have to go to the king. And Esther sent back a message. Mordecai, get all the Jews to fast and pray for 3 days, and my servants and I will do the same. And then I will go to see the king. And if I die, I die. So Esther and her servants fasted. So did Mordecai and all the Jewish people. And then Esther put on her royal robes and she went to see the king. And as she approached, she was afraid, but she knew God went with her. As she approached the king, what do you think the king did? Did he keep his scepter up or did he hold it out? He held it out. And Esther was allowed to come to see the king. And the king said, Esther, dear, what do you want? And she said, Dear king, would you come to a special feast that I'm preparing just for you? Oh, and bring Haman. Remember, he's the bad guy. Bring Haman with you. Well, okay. The king said, yes, we'll come. And Esther quickly went and prepared a feast for just the king and Haman and herself. And when they got to the feast, the king, after he'd eaten, said, okay, Esther, what would you like from me? I'll give it to you, up to half of my kingdom. And Esther, she wasn't quite ready to tell the king what she wanted yet. She said, King, would you come to another feast tomorrow night? Bring Haman with you again. And the king said, okay, I can do that. So away the king went, and away Haman went. And on the way home, Haman saw Mordecai again. And he was upset. Haman got upset with Mordecai. When he got home, he was so upset. And Haman's wife said, well, if you're going to be upset with Mordecai, why don't you have him killed? Build a gallows and hang him on it. And so Haman thought that was a good idea. That wasn't a good idea, was it? It's never good to be mean to people. But early the next morning, Haman decided he was going to go and see the king right away. But the king hadn't slept all night. He was wide awake, tired. He was so tired and couldn't get to sleep that he had somebody bring him the records of the kingdom. And they read him about all the things that happened in the kingdom. Now that should have put him to sleep, but it didn't. Especially when they read the record about this man, Mordecai, that had stopped two of the king's servants from killing the king. And the king said, what was ever done to thank Mordecai for saving me? And the man reading the record said, nothing was ever done for him. Well, early in the morning, when Haman came to see the king to make his request, the king was waiting. And he said, oh, Haman, come here, I need your advice. And Haman said, okay, king, what would you like? And the king said, there's a certain man in this country that I need to honor. I should have honored before, and it was forgotten. What should I do for a man that's done something very special for the king, and I want to honor him? And Haman thought, who but me? I'm the one that the king wants to honor, so let's make it good. King, I think for this person, you should put one of the king's crowns on his head, fancy kingly robe that you've worn on his person. Oh, and bring out one of the special king's horses and put the finery on the horse, the plume on his headdress, and decorate the horse up and put this man you want to honor on the horse. And then have one of your trusted, not servant, respected prince of the nation, have him lead the horse with this man on top throughout the city and have him proclaim, this is what happens to someone the king wishes to honor. Haman thought that was a really good idea, and the king did too. So the king said to Haman, Haman, sounds perfect. You go and do that to Mordecai. That was the very man that Haman wanted to kill. And now he had to dress him up like a king and parade him through town on the king's horse. Well, Haman had to do it because the king ordered it. By the time he got back home, he was upset and frustrated. But it was time to leave for the second feast that the queen was offering. So he had to quick hurry and get back to the palace for feast number 2. And it was a wonderful feast. And at the end of the feast, what did the king say again to Queen Esther? Esther, dear, what can I do for you? What is your request? Up to half of my kingdom I'll give you. And Esther said, Dear king, what I ask for is my life and the life of all my people. I'm a Jew, and you have sent a law out that destroys all the Jews. The king was a little confused. He said, Who would do this? And Esther pointed her finger to who? Haman. He was the bad guy, remember? The one that wanted to destroy not just Mordecai, but all the Jews. Well, the king was absolutely upset and angry, and he stormed away from the feast. And Haman, he wanted to ask the queen to change her mind and not say anything and let him get away with it. And he bumped into where the queen was sitting. And the king came back and saw that Haman had bumped into her, and he was mad. And he sent Haman away to be killed on the very gallows that Haman had set up to kill Mordecai on. Now, what happens next? The Jewish people are still to be destroyed. That was a law that could never be changed. So the king gave permission to Esther and also to Mordecai to write a new law. And in this new law, the Jewish people were able to defend themselves against anyone who attacked them. And they won. On the day of the big battle, the Jewish people won. And the king promoted Mordecai to a very special place of honor in the king's palace and gave him everything that belonged to Haman. And the Jews and everyone looked up to Mordecai. But none of this story, the Jews wouldn't have been safe if Esther hadn't stepped up and believed in God, prayed to him, and then approached the king, even though it meant she could have died. She was a great queen, a heroine. So there's one more story coming. Are you ready for it? It's a good one. A really special, more than a Bible hero. Talk to you again. Bye.